The shadow of Atlantis. 81. Azores. Its cold and hot springs, described by the ancient authors, are still flowing there as they flowed many millenniums ago. The mountain lakes of Atlantis have been transformed now into submerged ones. If we follow exactly Plato's indications and seek the site of Poseidonis among the half-submerged summits of the Azores, we will find it to the south of the island of Daliberata. There, upon an eminence, in the middle of a large and comparatively straight valley, which was well protected from the winds, stood the capital, the magnificent Poseidonis. But we cannot see that mighty center of an unknown prehistoric culture. Between us and the city of the Golden Gate is a layer of water 2 miles deep. It is strange that the scientists have sought Atlantis everywhere, but have given the least attention to this spot, which after all, was clearly indicated by Plato. I share entirely the astonishment of this honored German scientist, and wonder at the inertia which still prevents many archaeologists from seeing in the legends of Atlantis anything more than a poetical myth. Now I will dedicate a few words to the so-called biological argument in favor of the Atlantologists. We see, for instance, that the animal species of the Azores, Canaries, and Madeira do not present any peculiarity when compared with the species of the continents of Europe and America. The dew worms of the species Oligochaetes of the Canaries are analogous to the South European species. The shellfish of the Atlantic archipelagos resembled the Mediterranean species, and the butterfly, Cetamorpha decipunctae, is to be found in Africa and America, besides the Canaries. The island of St. Thomas, in the Gulf of Guinea, possesses 6 distinct species of corals. 4 of them are to be found also in the Bermudas, and 1 on the shores of Florida. On the shores of Senegal live 15 species of shellfish, which we can find nowhere save on the shores of the Caribbean islands. The mollusk, Oleocineta, is a very typical example for our subject. It can be found only on the shores of Portugal and in the Azores, Canaries, and Caribbean islands. This fact clearly shows that at one time, the shadow of Atlantis, a continent bridge extended from Portugal to the shores of Mexico and Yucatan. Shellfish attach their shells to the rocks on the shore and multiply and expand only in determined zones of the ocean, each species requiring a certain definite average temperature of water necessary for its existence. Therefore, it is easy to imagine that at one time the shore rocks of that ancient continent bridge were strewn with the shells of Oleocineta, but that when that bridge was destroyed, the shellfish remained only on the shores of the surviving parts. The structure of the quaternary layers of the Canaries is analogous to that of the quaternary layers of Mauritania. The sweet broom, a Dianthum reniform, which lives now only in the Azores and Canaries, has disappeared in Europe, but we can find its fossil remains in the Portuguese Pliocene layer. It is very interesting to note that there was a time when lions, tigers, camels, horses, and elephants lived in America. Paleontologists and archaeologists have found many fossil remains of these animals, so characteristic of the Old World. The archaeologist, Dr. Requena, for instance, discovered in the ancient tombs of Venezuela the tusks of the forefathers of modern tigers, the so-called saber-toothed primeval tiger. In the surroundings of the town of Natchez, in USA, were found the remains of Felis spelea, the giant cavern lion of the Quaternary period. Earlier scientists were of the opinion that the horse was introduced into America by the Spaniards, but recently fossil remains of the primeval horse were discovered in the New World. The famous German aurochs, Bos priscus, was numerous in Europe at the time of the Roman Emperor Augustus, but later on became almost completely exterminated. Some hundreds of this primeval ox, which is identical with the American bison, were preserved in the famous forest of Beloved, which belonged to the Russian emperors, but their almost complete extermination was one of the first actions of the liberated Russian people during the Revolution of 1917. The few examples of the American bison which were spared by the hunters, among them the first and most famous was the late President of USA, Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, are now preserved in special reservations. The fossil remains of the camel were found in Kansas, and recently, in 1934, the expedition of the Carnegie Institute discovered them also in New Mexico. The reader will probably 83. Remember the above-mentioned myth of the Chibchas in Colombia concerning Bochica. The latter and his wife came to Colombia mounted on camels, which proves that camels disappeared from South America not long ago and that the primeval races of the New World witnessed the presence of camels there. Petrified camels' bones, which are to be found in Bosa, a Colombian locality, are worshipped by the natives. New Mexico is situated on a desert tableland at an altitude of 6,000 feet, and the fossil remains of camels have been discovered in one of its solitary valleys. Scientists consider that camels never belonged to the autochthonous fauna of America. This supposition is based on the scarcity of such finds. Although the Atlantologists explain the presence of camels in America by the fact that in some remote epoch they were able to reach it through Atlantis, this hypothesis seems to be erroneous. On the primitive paintings of the oldest Egyptian monuments, all kinds of animals are represented save the camel, which apparently was not known to the first Egyptians. It appears only on the comparatively younger monuments, dating from much later, after the disappearance of Atlantis. If camels penetrated into America through Atlantis, the Egyptians' forefathers, who, according to Plato, were contemporaries of Atlanteans, should have shown these animals on their paintings. If we do not agree with Wegener's hypothesis, we can conclude that the camels came to America through the isthmus which once connected Alaska with Asia. The vestiges of this isthmus, the Aleutian and Kuril Islands, were recently investigated by Dr. Collins, a member of the Smithsonian Institute, who discovered on these islands the traces of some plants which are to be found on both sides of the straits, in Asia and America. This proves that many millenniums ago the migration of plants and very likely of animals through this isthmus was possible. Perhaps the camels also used this way coming into America from the Gobi Desert. As regards the elephant family, their fossil remains in America are represented by numerous skeletons of mastodons found in Florida, Mexico, Ecuador, and Colombia. This fossil species is called Mastodonto humboldti because the famous German naturalist was the first to find their remains. Near Bogotá, in about 7,000 feet above sea level, exists a vast field covered by innumerable mastodon skeletons entirely petrified. Being under the impression that these bones belong prehistoric giants, the natives call this site the Giants' Field. The existence of such a cemetery of mastodons makes us wonder, what calamity killed so many of those antediluvian monsters? And how did they manage to reach such an altitude? Were they not caught and destroyed by the sudden rising of their pasture ground? To some years ago in Marion, Florida, many skeletons of elephants, mammoths, and mastodons were extracted from the bottom of the Silver Springs. They were mixed with the remains of a primeval race of hunters, evidently contemporary to those giant pachyderms. The noted archaeologist, Edgar Howard of Philadelphia, says that this race existed 20,000 years ago. Although until now the fossil remains of elephants have not been found north of Florida, scientists believe that the oldest inhabitants of North America were aware of their existence. Some examples justify this hypothesis. There are, for instance, in Wisconsin, numerous mounds, or funeral tumuli, one of which possesses a profile resembling an elephant's head. It is necessary to mention that the mysterious prehistoric tribe of mound builders always gave their tumuli the shape of some animal. This custom shows that they had totemistic beliefs. The archaeologist John Short, on page 530 of his work concerning the ancient Americans, mentions the find in the excavations in Iowa of an artistically carved prehistoric smoking pipe, representing an elephant's head. The scientist Donnelly affirms that elephants, or perhaps mammoths, appear very often on the ancient American monuments. In fact, there is no doubt concerning the acquaintance of primeval American races with the elephant. It is enough to mention the images of elephants on the old Mexican manuscripts. Unless these paintings reveal intercourse between the Toltecs and the Hindus, which supposition is at least plausible, they indicate that the old races of Central America have seen elephants. Later on, in the chapter dedicated to the Mayas, we will give more details concerning the affinity between Toltec and Hindu mythologies, but for the moment we will mention only the famous bas-relief at Palenque.
Well, yeah, if the oldest people's bones that were found in the Americas are quote-unquote Negro, and they try to claim it's the variety of Australia, that still meant that they had to come through Asia to get to the Americas. So they would have seen elephants. Oh, man.
The shadow of Atlantis. Colombia, about 7,000 feet above sea level, exists a vast field covered by innumerable mastodon skeletons entirely petrified. Being under the impression that these bones belong to some prehistoric giants, it represents the figure of a priest. 85 adorned by a mask, which reproduces faithfully an elephant's head. If we take for granted, as we should, that there was a time when camels, elephants, and horses existed in the New World, we are confronted by two problems. Why did they disappear? And why did the ancient inhabitants of America not domesticate these useful animals and thus preserve them? We cannot explain their disappearance by the unfavorable climate, because horses, for instance, introduced by the Spaniards, were very soon acclimatized and multiplied. The Texas mustangs and the wild horses of the Argentinian pampas also multiplied very rapidly from a few heads brought by Spaniards from Europe. Now I would like to draw the reader's attention to the very curious phenomenon of the multiplication of eels, which clearly proves that some millenniums ago there was in existence a continent between Europe and America. Aristotle was the first naturalist interested in the multiplication of eels, but, not being able to discover anywhere the spawn of eels, he passed on this problem to the following generations of scientists, who, during the next 2,000 years, did nothing important towards its solution. They could only establish that the eel, a freshwater fish, yearly leaves its abode in the European rivers and goes in millions to the sea. If their river does not flow into the sea, the eels wriggle across the land to another river which does. Once in the seawater, the shoals of eels disappear somewhere in the ocean until they return to their rivers some months later. It was understood long ago that they go into the sea for spawning, but as to how and where they performed this process remained a mystery, particularly since only the adults were observed during those migrations and no one had ever seen their young. The Danish scientist, Dr. T. Schmidt, especially studied the lives of eels and gave in 1922 the solution of the problem first advanced 22 centuries ago. It turned out that only female eels live in the European rivers and their residence there is limited to 2 years. During this period eels often change their abodes, crawling from one river or pond into another. After 2 years the female eels begin to swim towards the mouths of the rivers, where the males are already waiting for. The shadow of Atlantis them. Then the separate shoals of eels merge into a large one. and start their long journey westwards across the ocean. They swim at a very great depth and, making 18 miles a day, after 140 days of swimming across the Atlantic, reach the so-called Sargasso Sea, near the Bermudas. This migratory movement is comparatively easy to observe, because it is closely followed by dolphins, various rapacious fish, and flights of seagulls. Reaching the Sargasso Sea, the eels disappear in its submarine forests. It is necessary to remind the reader that this sea is 6 times larger than the territory of European France, and is covered by a thick tangle of seaweed, which often even impedes the navigation of small ships. Our reader will, perhaps, remember what was said about the Sargasso Sea by the cunning Phoenician seafarers to the pharaoh Necho. The same conditions exist in the Sargasso Sea today. Incidentally, the scientific expedition of the American zoologist, Dr. Beebe, investigated this sea in 1927 and discovered there many new species of deep-water fauna. The spawning of eels takes place in the Sargasso Sea at a depth of about 1,000 feet, and after this the females die. The newborn eels soon start their trip to the European shores, forming one enormous shoal 260 feet wide and 70 feet deep. At the beginning, the tiny eels are transparent, but at the end of their journey, which lasts about 3 years, they become green and finally brown. Then, near the mouths of the European rivers, the shoal of grown-up eels divides into 2. The males remain in the sea, and the females enter the rivers and begin their 2-year sojourn in Europe. Thus the eel represents really 2 species: the male, a sea fish, and the female, which spends 1/2 of its life in fresh water. The phenomenon of the multiplication of eels is a very important fact for our subject. It proves that at some time a continent with a great river existed between Europe and the Bermudas. Perhaps the Sargasso Sea is the survival of the swampy delta of this giant prehistoric river, and the eels, accustomed during millions of years to spawn there in safety from their enemies, have preserved this habit until today, when not only that river, but the continent itself have disappeared. There is another curious phenomenon from the same range: biological proofs of the existence of a continent between America of this in Europe. It consists of a 87 European birds' peculiarity in the behavior of during their yearly migrations to South America. We possess accounts from many observers to the effect that the birds, reaching the parallel of the Azores, invariably begin to turn round and round above the sea. These pointless movements of the tired birds can be explained only by their instinctive recollection of the land which once existed in these regions. The hereditary instinct of the birds prevails over their senses, and they look for this land in order to rest even if they cannot find it. After an unsuccessful search, the flights of birds continue their long trip to the warm countries of South America, but next year, passing over the region where many millenniums ago were situated the mountains of Atlantis, they will again search for land. Certain Atlantologists of the past century have thought that the fact of the worldwide distribution of some species of useful plants and their non-existence in a wild state leads us to the following conclusion. All these plants were cultivated by the Atlanteans, their primitive wild species disappeared, and it is from the sunken continent that these useful plants have been distributed throughout the world. The best-known plants in this category are wheat, maize, tobacco, the banana, and the pineapple. The Hindu legend concerning wheat and the wonderful Kandali, i.e. the banana bush, says that the highest spirits, the protectors of mankind, the so-called Manu, brought them to our planet from another celestial body more advanced on the path of evolution than our Earth. It is necessary to explain that the banana tree does not exist at all. It is an annual plant, a bush, which multiplies not by seeds, which it does not possess, but by offshoots. As a matter of fact, the banana problem is very interesting. When, where, and how did mankind learn to obtain from a wild banana bush, Musa paradisiaca, or Musa sapientum, this magnificent cultivated plant, which furnishes food to millions of inhabitants in all parts of the world? You can find the cultivated banana even on the solitary islands of the Pacific, as well as in Central Africa, India, etc. The banana bush is a true benefactor of mankind. Its fruits contain everything necessary for man's nutrition and are even used for the distillation of alcoholic beverages. Its leaves and stems furnish fuel and materials for roofs, and its fibers are employed for the weaving of primitive tissues. The scientist Kuntz thought that the domestic species of banana was created by the Atlanteans at the beginning of the Quaternary period, and that many millenniums of cultivation were necessary in order to bring this useful plant to its present perfection. But recently there was found in Brazil the so-called pacoba, a wild species of banana which multiplies by seeds. Its fruits are edible, but not so palatable as those of the cultivated variety. So the hypothesis of Kuntz failed in its part concerning the exclusive role of the Atlanteans in banana culture. Certainly it is not impossible that they contributed much patience and labor to the production of the best species of banana bush, but we cannot now suppose that Atlantis at one time represented that center of banana expansion wherefrom this plant was diffused. Everywhere, the same fate was reserved for the hypothesis of the preponderant role of the Atlanteans in the expansion of the cultivated species of wheat. Recently, a Russian scientific expedition found in the Himalayas a wild species of this precious plant, triticum. Certain scientists had supposed that the fatherland of wheat was Palestine, but some years ago the famous Egyptologist, Sir Flinders Petrie, attempted to prove the Caucasian origin of wheat. This scientist relates a legend concerning Osiris, which is contained in the famous Book of the Dead. This legend tells that Osiris taught the first Egyptians to cultivate wheat. But this god came to Egypt from the Caucasus, and therefore Flinders Petrie thought that the seeds of the wheat must have been imported from that country. Moreover, Flinders Petrie found in the layers of the so-called Badrian culture, the oldest Egyptian culture, wheat seeds, which resemble very much the Caucasian species. At the same time, it was proved that neither Babylonia, nor any other neighboring land, possessed such a species of wheat. Only much later was the Badrian type of this plant substituted by the Babylonian one. It is interesting to mention here the account of a find made by a group of Bombay students in 1933. This group visited the ruins of the oldest city of Mohenjo-Daro in the province of Sindh, northern India. This city is so ancient that the Brahmin chronicles mention it for the last time in 3000 BC. 89. Wandering among the ruins of the prehistoric capital, one student found a broken ancient clay brick and within it a spike of some unknown gramineous plant resembling rye. The brick was dated 5,000 years BC. Evidently it had fallen by chance in the clay during the making of the bricks and had remained there ever since. This discovery of the Bombay students has proved that many millenniums ago there existed some gramineae, which produced later on by the way of evolution, or through man's labor, our modern species. Perhaps, the Mohenjo-Daro plant is one of the intermediate species of our rye, which was diffused on some vanished continent, e.g. on the earlier mentioned Gondwana. The wild species of maize has not yet been found, but certain scientists suppose that its fatherland is somewhere among the Andean valleys. We find there numerous species of maize, one of them with very large seeds. I have personally seen seeds of maize larger than 1 inch. According to Professor G. Bendar, a noted Russian naturalist, now working in Brazil, the wild species of tobacco has now been discovered in America. The origin of the pineapple is as mysterious as that of the banana. It is found in Asia only as a cultivated plant and is known there from antiquity. We can see, for instance, images of the pineapple on Assyrian and Babylonian monuments, but it is amazing enough that those images represent the American variety of the pineapple. In America for a long time, also, the wild species of the pineapple was unknown, but recently it was discovered in the Brazilian virgin forests. It is well known that certain plants are restricted to definite regions and are not found in others. So, for instance, with the so-called dragon tree, it is to be found only in the Canaries, whose flora, in general, is very peculiar. This circumstance is, it seems, another proof in favor of the Atlantis hypothesis. In 1934, Professor Mangan read a paper at the Academy of Sciences in Paris concerning the works of Professor Chevalier. This paper provokes some polemics among the scientists because Chevalier affirms that the aboriginal flora of the Cape Verde archipelago has nothing to do with that of the Black Continent, and that the African plants found on those islands derive their origin from the seeds brought there occasionally by winds, see. The shadow of Atlantis. Currents and birds. Therefore, these islands never were a pea of Africa. They are of volcanic formation and, according to Chevalier, never belonged to Atlantis either. The French scientist has reached the conclusion that the Cape Verde archipelago originated from the Tertiary period. However, these islands were at one time inhabited by some advanced race, because Professor Chevalier found on the rocks of Cape Verde, at São Antão, some mysterious inscriptions. Part. The statements of Chevalier and Mangan provoked an energetic answer from P. Lecour, president of the French Society of Atlantologists. He declared that Professor Chevalier was wrong in thinking that the Atlantologists ever affirmed an organic union between the Cape Verde Islands and the sunken continent. According to P. Lecour, only Madeira, the Azores, and Canaries can be considered to be remains of Atlantis. As to the Cape Verde archipelago, it appears to be merely the continuation of a submerged part of Africa, or it may have originated after some seismic phenomenon. As far as the value of the biological argument is concerned, I must say that although it is not so striking as the seismological and bathymetrical, nevertheless it gives some indications in favor of the Atlantis hypothesis.